Okay. We're here today with a person I have come to know and admire a lot over the last several years now, Clayton Decker, who World War II veteran, a submariner, or do you call yourself a submariner?
Submariner.
Submariner.
Yeah.
Clay has been part of our Regis University course on World War II, where we bring in veterans to talk to our students about their experiences. And so we're here today to kind of follow up on conversations we've already had with Clay about his experiences. But if I could just set the context here a bit. Clay was on the submarine, the Tang. It was commissioned in October 1943, had an admirable record during the war in the Pacific, sank 24 vessels with a total tonnage of 98,824, one of the most successful submarines in World War II. On its last mission, in the early morning hours of October 25th, 1944, the Tang was attacking a Japanese convoy in the Formosa Strait. It was hit by one of its own torpedoes. Only 5 men survived the sinking of the sub. Clay was one of them. Was it 5 or 9?
It was a total of 9, Dan.
Okay.
There was a total of 9, but there was the skipper and 3 men who were on the bridge. And so when the torpedo hit us, it blew them off clear into the water. Okay. And the rest of the crew, the rest of us, went to the bottom. Fortunately, a little bit about the geography of the Pacific Ocean, Formosa Straits, which is probably the shallowest water in the Pacific, but 180 feet. We went 180 feet to the bottom, yes.
Sunk by one of your own torpedoes that had misfired and came around and hit the boat.
The term that they used back in those days, Dan, was erratic torpedo or a circular run, known as a circular run. Now, we had a device that they came up with that you could install on a torpedo to prevent a circular run. But Dan, we had an awful lot hard time with torpedoes. We really did. Matter of fact, like I say, the Tang made 5 successful patrols. The 3rd patrol, we actually brought back 1 torpedo so that our people back at the home base could check it out and so forth, because we had such bad luck with torpedoes from the standpoint of misfiring. Example, fire a torpedo, it would hit the target and not explode. Fire a torpedo, it would go under the target and explode over on the beach. And so it was known, a circular run was a known factor. And they did have a device for it. Skipper O'Kane removed that device. He removed it off the torpedoes because we felt that maybe it was some of the problems we had with some of the other malfunctions that were taking place. Mm-hmm. But it just so happened that we didn't get out of the way, and we were on the surface too, that 5th and final patrol, as you mentioned. And I might correct you one thing there. You mentioned 24 ships sank. Dan, actually, the Tang only fired torpedoes on 4 patrols. The 2nd patrol, we never fired a torpedo. It was used strictly for rescuing shot down flyers on April of 1944, the island of Truk Island. And we went in there, the Tang went in there and picked up 22 flyers out of the water and rescued them. But the other 4 patrols, we had been given credit for 24 ships sank, 24 targets sank. It so happened that Admiral O'Kane, I call him Admiral now, but at the time when he was skipper of the Tang, he was rated a captain. But Captain O'Kane was selected after World War II to go over to Japan to be on the trials for the Japanese people who had been so bad to us when we were prisoners of war. And during his time over there at those trials in Japan after World War II, he had an occasion to go to their military department, mm-hmm. check their archives. And now, get this, Dan, he personally checked to find that I don't names, but you know they always Japanese use it as a maru, such and such a maru. He checked and discovered dates now to coincide dates and specific longitude, latitude. He coincided. The Tang wound up with 33 total ships sank. So it jumped from 24 to 33 after he had done what he did because the Japanese said, hey, no, such and such a maru was there and it went down. And we checked our people were the only submarine in the area. No, it was an area where there was no fly boys around or anything. We had to be the ones.
You survive. You're the only man to use the Munson lung and survive a sinking of the sub and live. Tom Brokaw interviewed you on his evening news broadcast when the Soviet sub went down.
When that Russian submarine went down, well, it's been almost 2 years. Well, a year and a half ago on the East Coast. Tom Brokaw called me, sent a limousine here to the house to pick me up to take me downtown to Channel 9 because here Tom comes on our time here at 6. Well, we're 2 hours difference, if you remember. So anyway, prior to going on the air back there on the East Coast for him, Tom came on and he said, Clay said, I understand this. I found this out, and he's correct. I'm the last living survivor of only 5 men ever in the world. Now this takes in our Navy, the German U-boats, you name it. Only 5 men ever in the world ever to have escaped successfully from a sunken submarine on their own. Dan, prior to World War II, 1939 to be specific, we had the submarine, one of our submarines called the Squalus. It went down on the East Coast with a crew of close to 70 men aboard. And they had a malfunction there that took them, they were in about 400 feet of water. And Admiral Mumson developed not only the Mumson lung that I use, but he developed what they call the Mumson diving bell. Now, half of that crew off the Squalus were rescued with the Mumson diving bell successfully. But there again, like I say, it was an apparatus that was used. In our particular case, we came up on our own using a Mumson lung, which resembles a Mae West life preserver, has a mouthpiece and a nose clamp, and you have to arrange the escape chamber properly in order to 4 minutes at a time to get in there.
Now, did this escape chamber, was that filled with water up to a certain point too?
The escape chamber was located, Dan, on the overhead in the forward torpedo room. There were actually 2 spots aboard World War II submarine where you could escape from. The escape chamber, which would accommodate 4 minutes at a time in the overhead in the forward torpedo room, or very aft compartment, which would be the after torpedo room. The only difference between the two is that, let's say that everyone was congregated in the after torpedo room. In that particular case, you flood the whole room, and everyone has to make the escape at the same time. There's no picking out for or volunteers or what. And the reason I bring that out, Dan, is because when we were sank and we finally congregated in the forward torpedo room, there were about 38 men. But Dan, of that 38, we had a man with a broken back, we had a man with a broken neck, we had 2 men with broken arms, we had a man with a broken leg. Now, those lads who were physically unable to escape, they simply crawled up on a bunk and said, that's it. They weren't even going to attempt to. But of those that were still left, 4 at a time could go up through a hatch in the overhead into this escape chamber. Then you close the hatch. Now, picture yourself in there, 4 men standing upright.
How large is this space?
Very close. I mean, it really is togetherness. 4 men standing together, I mean, you're almost touching noses.
Okay.
You're that close. You really are. It's a very small compartment, but it will accommodate 4 men standing. And the escape chamber hatch itself that you exit from is faced aft. So you're in this escape chamber. You first flood it with water, and that hatch, the top of that hatch would strike you about shoulder height. So that when you flood it with water, then you have gauges in that escape chamber. You have a fathometer, and the fathometer showed we were 180 feet. You have a pressure gauge which shows you the pressure in that compartment that you're in, the escape chamber itself. Then you have a pressure gauge that shows you the pressure of the external pressure outside your pressure hull. Now, that's very important for this reason. Remember, now we're down at 180 feet. I'm told, I'm not that good a mathematician either, but I'm told that the specific gravity of salt water at 180 feet, we actually had about 6,000 pounds per square inch against our bodies. So anyway, picture this. You fill that compartment, as I say, up to your shoulders with water, and then your head is in an air bubble, so to speak. We bleed air, high compressed air. We bleed it into that air bubble that we're standing in. We bleed it in there and watch the gauge to exceed the sea pressure 5 pounds. That, Dan, will let us open that hatch going to sea, which I said faced aft. It would open it just like you'd open a door in this room. No resistance at all. It would open because here we are standing in an air bubble, and that air bubble is pushing down on that water, and that water in turn is pushing against that hatch. So when you undog that hatch, it just freely opens. Now, it is a little scary when you first open it because, remember, you're sitting at the bottom.
Let me stop you there. Yeah. A little scary?
well, you're sitting at the bottom of the ocean.
Do you remember what you're feeling? I mean, you talk about it so calmly now.
Well,
and I know that you were trained well and you were doing what you had been trained to do, but that must have been incredibly frightening.
Well, it was. And when Dan, Tom Brokaw asked me those same questions, and his remarks were just about the same as what you just made. But as I told him, I said, look, I don't know, but I'm going to assume that the Russian government trained their people in their submarine service as we were trained by our government. And if so, while I was on Tom's program, it was interesting, one lady called in and she had questioned Tom, said, have a lady wants to ask you a question. I said, fine, go ahead. She said, do you think those boys are committing suicide? I said, oh, hell no, they're not committing suicide. Yeah. Like I say, they were trained. They know what they were supposed to do. And that same lady asked me, she said, well, did you ever think that was going to wind up being your tomb? And I said, I think every submarine sailor, probably every night that he laid his head on the pillow, he said, this iron tube could wind up being my tomb. But those boys, like I say, on that Russian submarine, they were down too deep to make even an escape with the mumps and lung. Had they have cooperated,
is the mumps and lung still being used?
No. The program that they have now trained their men in the submarine service to do, and I understand they've been successfully at over 300 feet. It's called free ascent or blow and go. In other words, where we put the lungs on and used them after we got into the escape chamber and rigged the escape chamber for escape, as I explained to you, when you open that hatch, the way we did it, there's a wooden buoy about the size of a soccer ball, and it has a line attached to it. And on that line, at every fathom or every 6 feet, is a knot.
Right.
Now, when I let the knot out, fortunately, in the first wave of 4, I had Chief Ballinger, Bill Ballinger, who he was a salty old dog. He had about 6 runs on the tunny before he came aboard the Tang. And when he asked for volunteers to go in that first wave of 4, I stepped forward really fast because I figured I'm going to get on his shirt tail. He knows where he's going. And so anyway, Bill gave me the buoy. I was standing closest to the hatch. And when I let the buoy out, he said, Clay, count the knots. Our fathom shows us to be 180 feet. But he said, count the knots as they go through your hand. Then simple mathematics, Dan. 6 times however many knots I had. And it came, and the reason I could tell when that buoy hit the surface, Dan, the line that I was holding onto it was doing this. Well, what it was doing, Dan, that buoy was riding on the waves, you see, and it was pulling me. So we knew then to sever the line. I took the end of the severed line, reached right out on the first rung of a ladder that's just outside the escape hatch there. I tied about 3 knots in that thing so it wasn't going to get away from us. the idea is that you want to hold yourself back from going. See, your body wants to go. It wants to go up. But you want to hold yourself back and hesitate at every knot. As you're going up, you wrap your legs around it, your arms around it, and you look up. And as each knot goes through your hands, you hesitate, exhale and inhale, move to the next knot. That allows you to equalize internal pressure with the external pressure. You see, as you're ascending, the external pressure is decreasing. So there is an escape valve down on this Mumps and lung, and all the time that you're escaping and making the ascent, there are bubbles, air bubbles that are coming out. They're going past you, they're going out. Because that lung wants to keep doing this, it wants to expand until you get towards the surface, and then there's not that much pressure against it. But out of the four of us that in that first wave of four, I'm the only one that made it, Dan. That Mumps and lung, interesting. As I say, it can be used as a life preserver also. There was a valve right at the mouthpiece. If you remembered, when you got to the surface, turn that valve, and then you could use it as a life preserver. Well, my only problem is I was asked by an interrogator after I got out of the prison camp about this escape and the way I went through the escape procedure. And when I got to the surface, he said, well, did you panic? And I said, well, I can't say that I panicked. But when I got to the surface and I reached up to take my nose clamp off, I was blood. Now, by that time, it was daylight. See, we first encountered those 35 ships in that convoy, Dan, which we sank 13 of them in that particular maneuver. But when I got to the surface, I reached up to take my nose clamp off, and I'm blood. My nose is bleeding, and my cheeks are bleeding, but I had no sensation of a pain or a stinging sensation or anything. Well, this lad explained to me, he said, well, Mr. Decker, he said, here's what's happened. He said, it's like in high altitude, you go high altitude, some people get a nosebleed. What happened is you didn't come up fast enough to get the bends, what is known as the bends. In that particular case, you really pass out. Well, you didn't do that, but you came up probably a little faster than you should have, and you probably broke the little superficial blood vessels in your cheeks and in your nose. And so being in that salty, cold water, in no time at all, the bleeding stopped. But when I reached up like this to take the nose clamp off, and I went like that, I'm all blood, well, I just spit the mouthpiece out. Forgot to reach down and turn that little valve, and so the Mumps and lung flooded down with salt water. It was no good to me then, so I just took it off and threw it away. But I had the buoy to hang on to. Like I say, about the size of a soccer ball, and it had handholds in it around that you could put your hand in and grab. So I just hung on to that. It was early in the morning. And remember now, in the morning, the tide comes out. You've heard the old saying, you can't swim against the tide. Believe me, you cannot swim against the tide when that's coming out. Fortunately for us, we were able to stay there and hang on to that buoy. All right, now, I mentioned Bill Ballinger, the chief of the boat. He was in that first wave before me. He did come up, Dan, about as close to me as you're sitting right now. Dan, I'm holding onto that buoy, and I could have reached out and grabbed Bill Ballinger. Bill was bleeding like I was. But not only that, he was screaming and he was vomiting. Now, I'm told there by the interrogating officer that the man was drowning. No doubt. You, Clay, was experiencing and watching a drowning man is what you were seeing. And I told him, and I've told everyone else, Dan, or the man upstairs, something told me not to reach out and grab him. I was tempted to. I mean, the man is screaming and hollering and so forth, and he saw me. We looked eyeball to eyeball. And I started to reach, and then I stopped. He said, Mr. Decker, I want to tell you something. Had you have reached out, you grabbed him, had he have been able to grab a hold of you, gotten a hold of you, it's a known fact that a drowning man could pull a horse under the water. He said, you would not be sitting here talking to me today if he'd have gotten a hold of you.
At the time, did you feel guilty for not reaching out to him?
Yes, I really did. I mean, because I could hear him screaming off in, finally, he was flowing with the tide then. It just carried him on out to sea.
That must have been awful, something like that.
Yeah, right. But like I say, something told me not to do it. I mean, it just something told me don't touch him. Don't touch him. Hey, now another thing, I've had people ask me then, how about the other two boys? You remember there was 4 of us in there. Dan, their bodies never did ever come to the surface. Now, we have to theorize, but here's what we theorize. I can't even remember those boys' name. And it so happened that we talked about it enough in time gone by that we determined that they were 2 lads who had just come aboard on that 5th patrol. You know, Dan, we made 5 patrols on the Tang, and here's what we experienced. I did anyway, because I commissioned her. I put her in commission. So I went through all 5 patrols. But after each patrol, being the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, we lost, I won't say half the crew, but a goodly number of our crew, Dan, and I'll tell you why. They were needing men. They were needing men, Dan, with a little bit of experience, say a patrol or 2 under their belt, back in the States for new construction. They were needing men to put boats in commission. And so those 2 lads that were in with Bill Ballinger and me, we finally decided that they were 2 of the young boys that I hadn't even gotten acquainted with yet. Because, you know, we were just starting on the 5th patrol when we went down. So anyway, but their bodies never came to the surface. So then the only thing we could theorize is, here you are, 180 feet, totally dark down there, pitch dark. When you came out of that escape, now we had a battery lighting in the escape chamber itself. Not very bright, but battery lighting. We could see what we were doing in there, but you step out, pitch dark. I mean, you only way you'd see your hand in front of you would be to touch your nose with your hand. And by the way, when you step out that hatch facing aft, you are then standing on the outside of the pressure hull, of the top side or the overhead of the forward torpedo room. Immediately in the deck, wooden deck above that escape chamber, was an opening in that wooden deck, a yardstick. That's 3 feet square. Now remember, that's not very large.
So they had to get up through there.
Oh, but if you did as you were trained to reach out where I had tied the line, you grab the line, you could go right out.
Got it.
Now those boys had to do this, Dan. They had to come out. They didn't get a hold of the line. If they ventured off past that 3 feet, they wouldn't have known whether to turn right or left or what. Now, you're in the area that we refer to as superstructure. So they went up, their heads bumped to the underside of the deck. They didn't know what to do, and they were drowned. They drowned right there. Yeah. And their bodies never came to the surface.
You know, this submarine service, you know, it's pretty dangerous, risky kinds of duty, it seems to me. Why did you volunteer for the submarine service in the first place?
And you know, you hit it on the nose there. The submarine service, submarine branch of the service of the Navy's Department is strictly a volunteer branch. And you have to volunteer to become a submariner. I mean, you're not just picked out of the ranks and put in submarine service. You have to volunteer. The other side of the coin is, I was married, had a 2-year-old son. Now, you've heard of the flyboys. When they get their wings and so forth, well, we as submariners got what we called our dolphins, a set of dolphins, meaning that when you became acquainted with that boat well enough, you became a qualified submariner. You got your dolphins, but immediately when you went aboard a submarine, you started to get extra pay. Now, Dan, I can't remember exactly what it didn't amount to really that much, but back in those days, it did amount to a lot. Just like here, you know, I showed you this poster I've got here. This thing here. See how old that poster is? It says, "Learn to operate a submarine."
Yeah.
A $7 million.
Yeah.
For $7 million, you couldn't even put the furniture in one compartment today on a submarine.
Now let me ask you this: let's go back to you're on the buoy at this point.
Stop here for a second. The phones really do come across.
Okay, hold. Do you need to say something? Okay.
No, I'm okay.
All right.
I'm sorry we interrupted you there.
We're going again.
How long were you in the water before you got picked up by the Japanese?
Okay, Dan, remember now I told you there were 5 of us made it successfully from the bottom then. I was the only one successful out of the first wave of 4. There were then 4 more waves of 4 And there was one man each only out of those 4 waves of 4. The other 3, and in those particular cases, none of the other bodies came up. And now we're going to presume that there was a 6th wave of 4, and here's why we presume so. There was a lad by the name of Larson. He was a first-class pharmacist mate. The 5 of us now are up there around this buoy. Larson came up. Oh, right up front, though, I'll tell you, we were in the water 5 hours before the Japs picked us up. But getting back to Larson, he did come up then. Now we're going to assume, we don't know, because Larson wasn't in quite as bad a shape as I explained to you about Bill Ballinger, the chief of the boat, but he was in bad shape. He was drowning. The man was vomiting, bleeding. He was bleeding, such as I was bleeding. But the 5 of us there, we managed to hold on to Larson and hold him afloat, and he was still alive. And now, so he wasn't in as bad a shape as Bill Ballinger was. And I mentioned to you that he'd get a hold of something. He knew us. I mean, he saw us, and he swam towards us even when he came up. He tried to make motions to come towards us. So, and he knew that we were trying to help him. He wasn't fighting us or anything like that. But still, he had taken on, he'd consumed enough water in his lungs and everything that, now Dan, we talked about that in the prison camp later on. Had we have had Larson on the beach, let's say, we no doubt could give him a little bit of help there and pump the water out of him, and he'd been in good shape. Anyway, we did keep Larson afloat, and he was still alive. We were in the water about 5 hours, and then a destroyer escort, Japanese destroyer escort, anchored off. We could see it off now it's broad daylight up there now. Anchored off about 1,000 yards from us. They lowered a whale boat, just 2 men rowing, Japanese, had their rifles with them. They rowed over to us. Now all that's there is this wooden buoy and the 5 of us, the 6 of us, Larson was there. We loaded Larson in that boat, the 5 of us. We got him in the boat. And then those 2 Japs, one of them had the gun on us, of course, the rifle, made us go to the back at the aft end of the boat, and they stayed up towards the bow. And then the other Jap, he was down there trying to get that buoy in the water. We didn't tell him it was anchored to the submarine down there, but he was yanking on. They finally gave up on that and said, well, the heck with it, you know. So the 2 of them, they rowed us back out there to the Jap destroyer escort. And they had a wooden ladder, a rope ladder down over the side of the boat, of the ship out there, the Japs did. And so we rowed up there to it. They started off there. I was the last man up that rope ladder. And as I was going up, I looked back over my shoulder like that, and those 2 Japs were just dumping Larson's body over the side. They didn't even try to give him any R&R or anything, you know. They didn't try to help him at all. They just dumped his body over the side. So that did away with Larson. Well, time I got to the top side then, the other 4 men had already gotten up there, and lo and behold, who do we see up there but the skipper and the other 3 men that had got blown clear into the water off the Tang before we were rescued. So that made all 9 of us there then together. Now, Dan, it probably was the roughest time we had in all the time we were prisoners of war in Japan, was that 5 days and 5 nights on that hot steel deck of that Japanese destroyer escort, because here we are in my particular case, I had denims on when I made the escape, and we'd come out of that submarine with the Gunner White brought sidearms for everybody. You know, we knew that was shark-infested water. So Gunner White brought enough sidearms for every man to have a .45. We had shells wrapped in gosling paper stuck in our pockets. We had sea rations. We unzipped the fly and unbuttoned the fly, and we had sea rations. We tied our pant legs with our shoestrings. We had sea rations down in the legs of our pants. You see, we were just off the China coast. Matter of fact, when we were in the water and holding on to that buoy, we could see the China coast over there. But remember now, the tide is coming out. Had the tide been going in, we probably could have made it to the coastline before those Japs picked us up. But anyway, most all the guys, finding and treading water and so on and so forth for that many time, we took the guns off, let all that weight go. We just didn't, it was just too much weight to try to swim and hold yourself up and carry. Well, we had 45s, we had a shark knife. Each man had a shark knife, and then all that stuff down in our pant legs. So there we were when we went aboard that Jap destroyer escort. We were in our shorts and a skivvy shirt. That was it. Otherwise, we were bare naked. And 5 days and 5 nights. Now, a submariner doesn't get any sunshine. And I mean, our skin was really fair. And that's tropical weather down there. And in 5 days out there on that steel deck, and we were so blistered from the sun that our lips were blistered and swollen. And we got no food, we got no water. And there were people that were there, Japanese people, that particular ship, that Jap destroyer escort, had picked up their people now of ships that we had sank in that convoy. Now, most all of their ships down either operated with what they were considered a coal burner or an oil burner. And that meant that down in the engine room you had these big, huge tanks of steam, because they're steam generated, you know. And some of those guys had been, a steam boiler had busted open, and they were just scalded like lobsters. They were red. Well, you get those guys aboard, and here we come aboard, and they say, hey, here's the guys that did this to us. But they do things like that. Probably like to say the worst treatment we got in all the time we were captured, and in the full year that we were prisoners of war. Like grab you by the hair, take a live cigarette butt and stick it up your nose and this sort of thing.
Did that ever happen to you?
Pardon?
Did that ever happen to you?
Oh, yes, you bet. Yeah, you bet. And then hit you with rifle butts and kick you and this sort of thing. But, you know, you talk about leadership and men, particularly officers, and I really take my hat off to Dick O'Kane, who was our skipper. Of course, I was just an enlisted man. I was second-class motor machinist mate, and there was 2 other officers in the group of 9 Tang survivors. There was Walt Flanagan. He was a torpedoman, a lieutenant grade, and also lieutenant was Larry Savatkin, and he was engineering officer. So they made 3 officers in with O'Kane and Savatkin and Flanagan. The rest of us were enlisted men. But Skipper O'Kane told all of us 8 of the rest of us, he said, anything that the Japs ask you, answer them. Don't tell them a lie. Don't let them catch you in a lie. He said, anything that you know, you could rest assured they already know. He said, I'm the guy they're after. And that's right. I mean, my Dick took some awful beatings. But he told us right up front. And I am so glad, Dan, I've thought so many times I've thought about that statement that Dick made to us. As example, me being an engineer, being a motor machinist mate in the forward engine room, now a throttleman there. And we had big new Fairbanks Morse diesel engines. The first prison camp we were in on the main island of Japan was inland from Yokohama, right at the foot of Mount Fujiyama. It was the wintertime, of course. You know, we went down October the 24th, 1944, in Formosa Straits. The time we wound up, a couple of weeks later, in there at Ofuna, inland from Yokohama, at the foot of Mount Fujiyama, it was strictly an interrogation camp. They had the Japanese Army, the Navy, Civil Defense, you name it, almost interrogated daily, and was isolation, 1 man to a cell. Couldn't speak to anybody else in the camp or any other prisoners, not even amongst ourselves. We were kept separate from each other. And they had an interrogation room, and when you'd go in there, and I'll never forget that what Dick O'Kane told me about, hey, telling them anything they want to know. The first chap that interviewed me about Fairbanks Morse diesel engines, Dan, believe it or not, I was in there probably 2 hours with him. And when we got through, here the man brings out a manual that had been published with the engine back at the factory. You know, he would have caught me in a lie just like that, and then this could have been the end for me, you know, because if they catch you in a lie, you know, we just take beatings. And they used to say, well, what'd you get beat for? Well, Dan, basically you got beatings for stealing food. Dan, I definitely feel this way. I felt it all along. I think the worst death a person could die from is starvation. Boy, I mean, you have to experience it to really know what starvation is. Because the very last stages, whether you're aware of it or not, you blow up, you explode, you get like this. And it's terrible. It's just absolutely terrible. So believe me, anytime we could steal food, we stole food. And if you got caught, it meant a beating. It meant a beating for you.
Did the Japanese comply with the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war, or were you treated differently because you had sunk Japanese ships?
We 9 survivors off the Tang were treated differently. Now, there were other submarine crews who were captured, and for instance, I'm going to name one, the Grenadier. The Grenadier, she scuttled her. They scuttled the Grenadier, and the Japs picked every last man up as a survivor, and but they were hither and yon. They never were all sent to the same prison camp, but they just mingled right in with the rest of the prisoners. But we 9 survivors off the Tang, when we were in that Ofuna, which was an interrogation camp, they classified us. They didn't make us prisoners of war, POWs. Talk about your Geneva Convention. They classified us as, the Japanese term is Kokobetsu Horyos, special prisoners of Japan. They contended this, that whenever we would sink a freighter, now that freighter, the cargo on that freighter could have been 95% munitions, but they contended that 90% of the crew were civilians, so therefore we were forwarding we were forwarding war against their civilian population, and we weren't entitled to be POWs. So that's the reason. And the big consequence of not being a POW then, and a Kokobetsu Horyo or special prisoner of Japan, we only got half the food rations that the other prisoners got in the same camps we were in. We were only in 2 different camps, but we only got half the food rations. They never did notify the Red Cross that we were captured. They never did notify our government that we were captured. And in my particular case, you remember now, I was married when I went aboard the Tang. I had a son 2 years old. When I got out of the prison camp in Japan and got back to the States, my first wife was remarried. She didn't know I was still. She got the wire, and I have a copy of it. The wire from the government. Hey, the man's dead. You know.
Missing in action?
Missing in action, presumed dead. Right. Matter of fact, she had collected on my insurance for about 6 months, and after I got back in circulation, they wanted me to pay that back. But the VA took care of it for me. So, but anyway, so anyway, not being a POW, it did have some consequence. You know, I mentioned to you that Pappy Boyington was my cellmate. And getting back to Geneva Convention again, yeah, interesting. Now, Pappy was an officer. He was a major at the time. And Dick O'Kane, and we had 3 officers. Once a month, the Japs would come around and pay Boyington and the other officers. They pay them in yen. No place to spend it, but anyway, they had yen. You know, I mean, they had money. Pappy had a. I never smoked, but I did smoke some when I was a prisoner of war. Once in a while, you do certain things that the Japs would want to have you to do, a chore of some kind, and they'd give you a cigarette. Well, it was something to do. It was something to do. So I did. I think I learned to smoke while I was a prisoner of war in Japan. I smoked a little bit. But Boyington, bless his heart, he was that was an absolute habit of his. And I remember they'd take us out on, when the B-29s got to coming over hot and heavy and there towards the end of the war over at Tokyo, they shoot down the B-29 crews. Why, the Cocobetsahorios, such as we were kept in a separate barracks away from other. That second camp we were in was Omari, which was an island out in Tokyo Bay with a wooden causeway leading out to it. It had about 600 prisoners in it. And we 9 and Boynton, and there was about 4 other guys. Gentlemen, I can't say their names right now. A couple of fly boys, and then one lad who was Arthur from Hershey, Pennsylvania, just a little guy. And by the way, he did die of starvation there in the camp. But they did get to taking us out in areas where, you know, outside of Tokyo there, almost all those houses are bamboo houses. Our boys would come over there, drop one incendiary bomb, it wiped 7 blocks out, just like that. Well, they'd take Cocobetsahorios, they'd take us out, march us out there in that area, and we'd load the dead bodies on flatbed trucks, and then we'd clean up the areas and plant a garden. Well, at least it gave us something to do, you know, rather than to be in that darn barracks all day long and not even out exercising at all. So, I mean, we were glad to do it. We were glad that we were able to do it. But with Boynton, you know, we'd be out doing one of those exercises, and he'd be looking at the ground all the time to find Japanese cigarette butts had been thrown away. And maybe we'd come back in at night, he'd have a handful of tobacco about like that. And what we'd do, if we had to stay in, we didn't go out the next day, in our cell, with Boynton and I were cellmates, we had about a 1.5 square window in our cell. And at a certain time of the day, the sun was shining just right. You remember, Dan, years ago, flashlights. Instead of just a straight lens on it, as they are today, they had a convex lens. You could take that lens, remember when you were a youngster, you could start a fire with it. Take it as a magnifying glass. Well, we found one of those when we were out, you know, working in the debris and everything. So Boynton had one of them. Well, he'd have me hold the lens when that sun had come through that just right. He'd roll that tobacco in yen that they paid him, see? And then he'd get up there in his mouth with one in there, and I'd get the light right on there, get one started. Well, maybe he'd had 4 or 5. But then he had to smoke all of them because the sun would change, you know, and I couldn't light another one. But
did you, I mean, when you were cellmates with Pappy Boynton, was he already kind of a legendary type of figure? Did you know?
Oh, yeah, well, listen, of course, all we Americans definitely knew Pappy. I mean, you know, you talk about heroes. You know, Dan, I've got a couple of things. One, there's a little deal up there on the USS Maryland. I went aboard it, and the boys on that crew gave me a nice plaque off the USS. It's one of the new atomic submarines, and they call me a real hero. Well, I can't say that I really feel like. Well, you take Boynton, Dan. Here's a man that shot down 28 zeros on himself. You know, this guy's a real hero. Mm-hmm. I mean, you just back in those days, us being young guys, we just to go up. Pappy was about 10 years my senior. But just to go up and touch the guy, you know, even made you feel good. It's interesting, Dan, that first camp we were in the interrogation camp, that's where we met Pappy. See, he got shot down over a ball about a year before we were shot down, before we were captured. And he was working in a galley. He had a job in the galley at that first camp at Ofuna. That's where we first met him. Experience we had, the winter of 1944. Now, whenever they would beat anybody, that camp was set up. It had a parade ground kind of here, short little parade ground, 2 long barrackses, and they were kind of like down in San Joaquin Valley, these potato cellars. They're partially underground. That's what they were. Of course, that saved our bacon from the cold and stuff. You know, a lot of people don't realize it gets 0 degrees weather and 2 foot of snow on the ground over there in Japan in the wintertime. No heat in any of those buildings, no heat. Anyway, had a pole right in the center of that parade ground, and it had a hook on it. And whenever they beat anybody, over on this side in this compound, we had Now, I'm not mentioning this to be derogatory, but our allies, you remember, were the British. We, Dan, we called them limeys, and we didn't mean it to be derogatory or anything, but they were our allies, and they were most of those. They were in this barracks over here. We were most Americans over here, flyboys mostly, other than the Tang survivors, and Boyington, and. Those British guys, or the limeys, they didn't think that much about Pappy as far as being a hero, you know. I mean, so what? So he shot down 28 zeros. They couldn't really call him a hero. You got that impression anyway, you know. Well, one day Pappy got caught smoking when he should not have been. That's a beating, stealing food, as I mentioned, or get caught doing something. He got caught smoking, and he shouldn't have been. And so called everybody out of the barracks, out of your cells, standing at attention. Now here we are on this side, and here are the British boys over here. Here's the pole, and a little short Jap with a club about that big around, stripped Pappy to his waist, tied his wrists like that, put him up over the hook, and then just beat his back down until it was bleeding. When he got him down, untied him, he's standing at attention. Now, the Japanese word for you is anadawa. The Japanese word for me is watashiwa. And the Japanese word for understand is wakaru. So that little Jap looking up at Pappy, almost spitting in his face, he's saying, anadawa wakaru, anadawa wakaru. What he's saying is, do you understand why I just beat the hell out of you? And Boyington's standing there at attention, and all of us that are standing at attention, no expressions on our faces, and Boyington says, watashiwa wakaru. Watashiwa wakaru. Now go screw yourself, little man. Oh my God, I mean, you know, Dan, from that point forward, don't for a minute think that those boys, those limeys or British boys, they thought that guy was a #1 tops, you know, I mean, really. He was a real hero to them. They thought anybody that could do something like, of course, we realize this, they didn't understand English and so forth. But man, when he said that, I mean, boy, all of us had to really make ourselves rigid, you know. But he was quite a guy. He sure was. Matter of fact, those final days, when we were in Omari, there on the island, just outside of Tokyo, those B-29 boys, they'd get shot down. Well, you know, heck, they got shot down. They just had eggs and bacon for breakfast, and now they're shot down and they're going to be fed Milo maize, see? I mean, it's interesting. The Japs themselves like polished rice. And whether you realize it or not, when you polish rice, you take a lot of the goodies away as far as nutrients are concerned. So they fed us Milo maize or Kathy corn. It's chicken feed here in the States, chicken feed. But it had far more value, food value, than their polished rice. We just didn't get enough of it. That's the big thing. But Pappy would say to those guys, like I say, they had bacon and eggs for breakfast. But now it's going to be dinner time and evening meal, and here they come with Milo maize, you know, and they're looking at us and saying, nah, the war's going to be over before I get used to eating that. Well, he'd tell them, well, you better learn how to eat a little bit of that. And then, but he'd always, every man that would come in knew, you know, the only way we could communicate, we weren't supposed to be in Cocoa Beds, we weren't supposed to communicate. They had a paper-thin wall in the same barracks we were in, and a lot of B-29 boys were over on that other side of that. Okay, the way, we knew that they couldn't understand English, the majority of them. The way we communicated was sing a song. Oh, example, the World War II, one of the popular songs was Don't Fence Me In. Well, you'd start to sing Don't Fence Me In and change the lyrics, see? And you'd communicate with somebody right there on the other side of that paper-thin wall. But Pappy would tell every man that just came in, he said, hey, don't get your dauber down, hang in there, keep your chin up, because I'm personally inviting you to a luau that I'm going to throw at the top of the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco when this is all over with. You know, just to try to cheer him up a little bit. Well, as a matter of fact, when the war was over and the Japs called us all out of the barracks and everything out in the big parade ground, the big wheels now that run the camp, they called us together. They told us, hey, the war is over with. We're getting out of here. we're turning the camp over to you guys, which they did. They just left 4 guards standing in a guard shack out at the main gate. That's all. Well, you know, the way it goes in the military, it's chain of command. In other words, the highest ranking officer under any circumstance should be the one in charge to give orders or what or what. Well, we had a 1-star general from Australia there in that. There were about, like I say, about 600 prisoners in that Omari prison camp. There where I was liberated, that picture that you have of me being liberated. And, but hey, we all got together and voted, and we voted Boyington. Now, we were only in our own, under our own ruling for about not quite a full week before Bull Halsey, Admiral Halsey, came into Tokyo Bay with the 5th Fleet. The Missouri, of course, was amongst it, where they signed the papers. He also had, Halsey had the hospital ship Benevolence attached to the 5th Fleet, and that's where they took us. That picture that you have of me being liberated from Omari, they came in, see, remember now, it's an island right in Tokyo Bay. Yeah, they came in with, yeah, you might show that to the cameraman there.
We'll shoot that second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hold on just a second. Wait a second here. Let me change something here.
They came into that island with Higgins landing boats. That's what, when we were all waving right there, we were waving because there's Higgins landing boats right there. They took us out, took us aboard the hospital ship Benevolence from right there from the camp. So, and Dan, like I say, you know, Pappy being my cellmate, Dan, was one of the first 21 prisoners of war of Japan to return back to the United States. Pappy Boyington was, Dan, I don't know airplanes that well, but I'm told, it was a C-54. And it was at the Yokosuka Naval Station, right there at Tokyo Bay. And it didn't have seats. It had benches down the side. And there was 20 officers aboard and this one Dutchman. And, you know, I used to say to Pappy, I'd get him, I'd say, Pappy, he always called me Deck, short for Decker. And I said, Pappy, did you get me on this flight? Oh, hell, Deck, I didn't have anything to do with it. Well, he did. I know he did, you know. Why would I be on that flight?
Did you stay in touch with him after the war?
Pardon?
Did you stay in touch with him after the war?
Oh, yeah, you bet. And he did have that luau at the top of the mark, and I got to go to it, you bet. You bet. Oh, yes. And you saw the one picture I taken in there. He came to you know, he was an alcoholic. Matter of fact, I don't know if you've read his book or not, Baba Black Sheep.
Mm-hmm.
It depicts the Black Sheep Squadron. But he was an alcoholic. Before he wrote that book, Dan, he was refereeing wrestling matches down in the Los Angeles area, what we'd call Larimer Street, you know, here in Denver. And then he finally got on the wagon, picked himself up by the bootstraps, hired him a ghostwriter, and wrote the book Baba Black Sheep. And but he passed away in '94, and like I say, he was about 10 years my senior. And I just had my 81st birthday in December, so I'm working on 82. So he was up there several years above me. But heck of a nice guy, and I'm told that he didn't catch it soon enough, that his liver was gone because of his drinking. But
when you got back home, you find that your wife has remarried, so there's a new father for your son. What was that like?
Well, Dan, let's start this way too. Let me say this to you. Okay, from the time that I went aboard the Tang until I got back, 2 years had passed. I've looked at it this way, Dan. Had I have died, had I have gone down with the Tang, I wouldn't have wanted her to raise that boy by herself. I would have wanted her to remarry, you know, really. But the only thing that I held out this way. I wanted the boy. I mean, because it takes times when I was taking beatings and everything, I'd say, hey, I'm going to let him beat me. I can take this because I'm going to get back to where I see that little boy of mine, So I got the boy when we divorced. I got the boy, and my present wife Annie and I, hey, this year we're working on our 55th year. So and that lad, in June of this year, will be 61 years old, and he's my present wife Annie, whom you know. Uh, she's the only one that he really knows as a mother. I mean, because Annie and I married when Harry was about 5 years old, so she really raised him.
How did the war change your life? When you get back home, what did you do?
Well, Dan, it's interesting. Uh, the monetary situation. A lot of people say, "Well, how about your back pay?" Dan, it's interesting. We only got $1 a day for the time we was in the prison camps. That's what our government gave us. Hey, but hey, when they paid me that $1 a day, I went out and bought a car, which I needed. I needed a set of wheels. And I wouldn't have been able to buy that first car if it hadn't been for that $1 a day that I got, But back in those days, you could buy a pretty darn good used car for $200 or $300. And so that's the way I used my money there. And then the Japs never gave us any medical treatment. We got no medical attention whatsoever. So going back almost from the beginning, Dan, when I became a civilian, I had been on 30% disability with the government, and which every little bit helped back in those days. And of course, back in those days, I might mention Dick O'Kane, our skipper. Another thing he told all of us 9 survivors of the tank, 8 survivors, he said, "Let me say this to you guys: if you want to make the submarine service or the Navy a career, I'll guarantee you this, that wherever I go," he was going to stay in and so on, "wherever I go, you'll go. And I'll guarantee you, particularly we enlisted men, that every year you will get an increase in rate, except when you get to become an officer, then you're on your own." And 2 of the boys did take him up on it. A first-class boatswain's mate took him up on it. Hey, and that first-class boatswain's mate retired a full commander after 20 years, right? No, he had a little more than 20 years. He was in maybe closer to 25 years, Leopold was. Floyd Caverly, Chief Warrant. He made Chief Warrant. So he was starting up the ladder also, but he stayed in, made it a career.
But you decided not to stay in, and you went into business for yourself.
Well, because I thought I had a family back there, but even after that happened, Dan, I decided that no, because my first wife had been living out in California, and she was still out there. Well, I came back to Colorado then and brought my son Harry with me, and that's where I met my present wife Ann back here, and the 2 of us then were busy. And my present wife, Ann, is born and raised in Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania. So but her first job was she was director of the occupational therapy department at Children's Hospital. And we met in a ski club. So busy trying to make ends meet back in those days. We didn't do much of anything as far as my past experience as a POW or ex-World War II submarine veteran. And it's really interesting. Until you folks there at Regis started this program, and believe me, it has made a lot of us old guys really feel great, Dan, that these young people are as interested in what happened back there as they are now today. Because that hasn't been true in years gone by, Dan. I mean, it's just like, so what, But it seems like the last couple of 3 years, the youngsters are being are more interested in, hey, what really happened back then? What took place? And true enough, and actually a submarine, the boat that I was on, Dan, if you take it out for the average layman, if you'd take it out of the water and put it in a football field, the bow would touch one goalpost and the stern would touch the other. Today, the nuclear boats, 2 football fields, Dan, 4 stories deep, Dan. Mercy. What you have there is a submersible city. You have a submersible city. You know, and I'll say this. World War II submariners have been particularly the Pacific Ocean. We had a very small percentage, and I once knew it, and Dan, it was less than 10% of personnel and equipment, but we sank better than 76% of the shipping that was sank in the Pacific with that small percentage of people and equipment. And another thing, had it not have been for our submarine force, World War II would not have ended when it did. It would have definitely gone on longer than, you know, those Japanese, they had to depend on everything from shipping. Just about all of their raw material came in by shipping.
If you had to do it all over again, would you have joined the submarine service? Would you have volunteered?
I think so. I do. Because I've always felt that the submariners themselves, not that they're need to be put on a pedestal or anything, but think about it a minute. You know, I used to think flyboys, people that go out on missions flying, they had to be the closest knit. But you stop and think about it. They come in off of a mission flying. The officers go this way and the enlisted men go that way. Hell, I mean, we're out there a minimum of 60 days on a patrol, more like 70, 75 days. And after we'd gone through one hell of a lacing, for instance, like I say, on one occasion on a 4th patrol, one occasion, depth charge-wise, we took 152 depth charges. And after that's all over with, believe me, you're shook up pretty good. But hey, the officers eat the same chow we ate. We go to the same head that we eat. We smell each other's armpits. It's a pretty close knit.
Did you keep in touch with the survivors?
Yes, we do. Now they've got a group, Dan. This year will be the 48th National Convention of World War II submarine veterans. I had a little bit of an objection to it years ago because when they organized this group, the only way they were letting younger lads in who maybe made a career in the submarine service, but after World War II, was as associate members. Well, hey, those young guys said, hey, no way. So they have started their own group, and they call themselves U.S. Submarine Veterans, Inc., I-N-C. And my feeling on it, way back then, when I said, yeah, we ought to let those boys in as members, even though you're calling it World War II sub-vets, you better let them in as members. We're all going to be gone, Dan. And Dan, as an example, we have a beautiful memorial. Now let me get it right now. The southeast corner of Sloan's Lake. There's a Mark 18 torpedo mounted there, which is a memorial. See, Dan, we lost 52 submarines in World War II. United States did. We lost 52 submarines. Dan, U-boats. You heard about German U-boats? They lost 736. Mercy. But that memorial down there, okay, it's anything that's out in the public like that. In time gone by, it'll get graffiti on it. So we old poopers, we'd go down there once a year and do some sandblasting and clean it all up. Dan, we can't do that anymore. If it weren't for these young guys that are coming up now, boy, they've just taken the bull by the horns. And now, with the first convention we're going to have, not this year, it'll be next year in Reno, the way they've got it set up now. It will be the combined, the younger and the older group. They're going to get together and combine the convention.
Did you start going to these reunions right away when you?
When they first started, they went to see Run Silent, Run Deep in a movie theater out in Aurora. And Ann and I went to that movie. I didn't join right then. I mean, Ann and I were getting ready to make a trip back to visit her folks in Pennsylvania, and it was 4 or 5 years after that. But just, you could pick out the year because, like I say, this will be the 48th year this year. So no, I didn't join right in the very beginning, Dan. I didn't. And then, like I say, 9 survivors of the Tang. The first lad that left us was Truckee. Would you believe it? I mean, he come up in the bottom with me off the Tang. He drowned in a swimming pool. He was drunk, but he drowned in a swimming pool. But of the 9 of us, there's still 4 of us living. Myself, being the last survivor of the 5 that came up in the bottom. But the other 3 lads, 2 of them are living in California, and 1 of them living up in Eugene, Oregon. And they're right. As a matter of fact, Caverly, who's up in Eugene, Oregon, he's 2 years older than I am, even. Right.
Did you have contact with them after the war all these years, the survivors of the Tang?
It was, Dan, it was probably more like in the last of the 70s when we, now we had off and on between when we were made civilians and the last of the 70s when we, Tang survivors started getting together, I would see 1 or 2 of them here and there. Caverly was one. Annie and I'd be traveling up that way. We'd look him up. But after we really got together for about a 10-year period, a good 10-year period, we got together every year at some one of the survivors' home. And the very last one we had was in '91, and when we were living up in Westminster. And I have a picture of that over there on the wall, too.
So you started in 1981 or thereabouts when
Yeah.
you started getting
Yeah.
together on a regular basis
Right.
every year.
Right. Yeah, and for the most part, we were all retired at that time. And I think you've heard me say, the skipper, Dick O'Kane. It's boiled down to this. There were the entire submarine fleet. There were 7 Medal of Honor holders, 7 Medal of Honor recipients in the submarine service, and Dick O'Kane was one of them, our skipper. The latest book out is that one called "The Bravest Man," written by William Tuohy, Tuohy. And by the way, he was had been a previous Pulitzer Prize winner. Lives in London, but he is a journalist for the Los Angeles Times, and did a good job. Not being a submariner, I think he did an outstanding job myself. It's interesting. He called me from London. Right, we were living here at the time. See, Ann and I have been down here with daughter and son-in-law for 3 years now. Can't believe it. Time and tide waits for no man. But 3 years we've been down here. And he called me down here a year ago when he was writing the book and talked for over 2 hours. And Ann got through. He said, "Well, where was he?" I said, "Over in London." She said, "Oh, I'm glad he's picking up the tab." But nice guy, and I think he did a nice job.
And you were a Silver Star winner.
Yes, yeah. And the one maneuver that I made, now, like I say, now to qualify on submarines, Dan, you had to do it aboard the boat. You had to be attached to a boat. If you were a submariner, even today with the nuclear boats, you could be in a relief crew and so forth. You can't qualify. You have to be attached to a boat, and you have to qualify aboard a boat. And here's what it amounts to. On the boats that I served on, and by the way, World War II submarines were named after fish. Now, I'm told that the tang was a tropical fish. I can't say that I've ever seen a tang. But anyway, the diving officer, or the qualifying officer, whoever it might be aboard the boat, the boats that we served on, there are over 5,000 lines, valves, gauges, you name it. And you have to go through that boat with that diving, with that qualifying officer. He just points to a valve, Dan, and says, "What is it? What's it do? What's its purpose?" He points to a line. What's in that line? Air, water, oil, fuel, what? You had to know. Now, the only thing we didn't have to know was how to actually operate the radar, other than turn it on and to be able to cipher a pip, which on the screen, which would be resemble a target. The other thing was radio-wise, we had to know how to turn the radio on and send an SOS. And that was it. Torpedo-wise, you had to know how to fire a torpedo manually. So because you had so many duties aboard a submarine, Dan, that were so specific. I mean, whether you realize it or not, in the Navy, you have right arm ratings and left arm ratings. Well, what I didn't find out until after I got in the Navy, deep into the Navy, that right arm ratings is pretty much you stay in the service for right arm ratings. Left arm ratings, you get out of the service, and it could well be a line of a profession that you could use outside of the service. Like motor machinist mates, or radar technicians, or I'm trying to think of some of the others. Air conditioning, refrigeration, stuff like that. Left arm ratings. You had a reason for you could get out and get a job with them. When I went aboard the Tang, I just come out of torpedo school, and I got a third-class torpedoman's rating. Had a class of, I got a picture up there. It showed, I don't know, 21, 22, maybe more than that. In that class, I was number one in the class, and I got a third-class torpedo rating. I went aboard the Tang, first patrol. Not too many submarines had boatswains mate aboard. This boatswain mate, nice guy. He was one of the survivors, too. We got acquainted while we were really in the prison camp. But I thought this guy was related to Hitler, the way he cracked a whip on that boat, So I broke down. After the first patrol, I broke down from torpedo and went back with the black gang because he didn't have any authority back there in the engine room. But anyway, I learned the engines back there. So many people don't realize, we needed the skipper, we needed officers, we needed those people to know how to really to lead men and be at the top spots. But boy, without each one of us, example, I was a throttleman. 2 big diesel engines, Dan. Dan, when they shut that main induction off, I've got what they call a Christmas tree up there. When that main induction is open, I've got a green light. When then the main induction is closed, that light turns red, and I'm on the throttles. Dan, if I am not watching that, and we get the diving alarm, and if I don't shut those engines down, when that light turns red, all those engines have to do is to make about 10 complete cycles each, and they'd break every man's eardrums on that boat. That's how much air is needed by those engines to make them run. 2 things that'll run a gas engine or a diesel engine, air and fuel. And I mean, if they close that main induction, the only air left is the air in that boat. And it would break every man's eardrums. That's how essential it was. Another thing, using the head. Not so today, but back in those days, using a head, go to the bathroom. It's a possibility that a man could go to use the bathroom and flood that boat. Flood that boat down, yeah. If he didn't do the valves just right, he could take on seawater and flood that boat down. So, I mean, the enlisted man aboard the submarine was, each and every one of them was very, very important men. So many people don't realize it. The screws on a submarine, they're not turned by the engines, these diesel engines. These diesel engines generate electricity, go into big storage batteries, and there's electric motors that turn those screws. Mm-hmm. Well, that means those big batteries have to be tended to. Those guys that went down, and you've probably seen it in your own car. You go into a service station, now they've got a gauge that they just put down on your positive and negative post. But it could spark a little bit when they do that. Here, it's out in the open, it doesn't matter. But not aboard a submarine, you don't want any spark. You're down there and you've got those batteries charging and all that gas that's being created. You had one little spark, you'd blow that submarine to sky high. So anybody that goes down there, the way they test those batteries, each and every one, the level of the batteries, and then the water. Had to constantly be putting water in those batteries, fresh water, and we made our own fresh water. But use a hydrometer. You use a hydrometer to test to see whether the battery acid was and whether it was up or down or whatever. When they'd go down below, you'd wear nothing metal, nothing. You wear nothing metal, nothing that could cause a spark while you're down, because it's below decks in the officer's territory, in the second compartment, back from the forward torpedo room. That's forward battery compartment. All that below decks is battery, and then you get back past the control room in the galley and the cruise quarters and everything. Everything underneath is batteries, and every hour a man goes below decks, Dan, with a flashlight that won't create a spark, and nothing metal on him, so that he can go down there and check the status of those batteries. Every hour they're checked. And of course the idea is we're down submerged all day long. At nighttime we come up, turn on the full bend on those diesel engines, bring those batteries back up again. We're ready to dive again.
For what action did you win the Silver Star? What was the specific?
Oh, okay. Like I say, I qualified then on the second patrol on the tank. And knowing then all these lines, emergency lighting, where it was located, everything that worked hydraulically on World War II submarines could be operated manually. In other words, if the hydraulic is knocked out, you could operate it manually. Well, I was in the control room when the torpedo hit us on the port side. Remember now, I told you, if that boat was out on the football field, the goalpost would fit. That's 300 feet. That's 300 feet. We were on 180 feet of water. Torpedo hit us astern. So here's what you got, 180 feet of water, and you got a submarine in there at about a 45-degree angle. In other words, it's setting on the stern, on the bottom. There's no way, Dan, we had to get up that forward torpedo room. There's no way we can get up there to get in that escape chamber to make that ascent unless that boat is level. So I'm the one then, from my seat right there on the port side, right below the hatch going up in the conning tower, I'm the one that crawled over on the chart desk. There's a lever that I learned in my becoming a qualified submariner, that one lever on the overhead, it was about 3 feet long. It was around like a piece of pipe, like about 2-inch pipe, maybe 1.5-inch pipe. It had a pin below it on the lower end, and it went from forward to aft. And the pin was aft, but I had to crawl up on the chart desk, throw my legs up around it, use my weight, pull that pin, and that lever come down like this, right over the top of the chart desk. That opened the vent valves forward to all the ballast tanks forward, Dan. Your ballast tanks surround the pressure hull. You got flood valve down here, you got vent valves up here. When we go on patrol, we open the flood valves and lock them open. We don't operate them anymore when you go on patrol. The reason we don't is because if we would have them closed and we'd take a depth charge down underneath the boat and damage that mechanism down there, we would never be able to make it to the surface. We got to have that open, so we close the vent valves, put the pressure in that tank, and blow that water out and give us negative buoyancy, or positive buoyancy. Now, to dive, you open the flood valves, let them flood down, the water coming in down here through the flood valves, give you negative buoyancy to give you weight to take you down. So I was the one then that opened the vent valves manually then, and that submarine then, like I say, about a 45-degree angle, she just worked like this. She went down and sit right on the bottom. Then that let us go on forward to the forward torpedo room. Well, for that maneuver, had I not have done that, Dick O'Kane talked to us when we were aboard the hospital ship Benevolence. Like I say, we were taken off out of the prison camp there first thing. And Dick said, Clay said, I'm going to give you a Silver Star for that maneuver. And I said, well, appreciate that, Dick. I sure do. But I said, Dick, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying in the control room after that torpedo hit, where I was, the stern planeman, he was over to my left. He was sitting on the same bench with me. But I didn't get a bruise, Dan. I didn't get a scratch even. But we had men there, we're in bad shape. I mean, the diving officer, He was thrown. He was standing right there in the middle of that control room. He was thrown across that room and bashed against the bulkhead. And Jimmy White, the gunner's mate, he was on the helm, and boy, it banged Jimmy. Jimmy was bleeding at the forehead and so forth. It really threw him around because there he was. He was just standing, freestanding, where I was sitting.
Did you ever wonder why you survived and others didn't?
Yeah, you bet I have. Yeah, there must be a reason for it, Dan. It's just like, you know, something else, Dan, that we didn't realize. Here, you see me on this oxygen today, Dan. We didn't realize it back in those days, but those inside of those boats were absolutely loaded with asbestos. Now the pressure hull itself had about 2 inches, 2.5 inches of cork, but the lines and all this asbestos every place in that submarine, and my, you know, today they even run into schoolrooms where there've been asbestos ceilings painted over and everything, and they're all concerned about the students being exposed to asbestos. Can you imagine? You know, it's interesting. One of the doctors and supervisors out at the VA hospital, he told me, he said, Clay, it blows my mind to think about you down there, 400 feet, sitting on the bottom, and you're taking these depth charges. That asbestos ought to be so thick in the air you could take a teacup and scoop it up. And we were breathing it right into our lungs. So this could be some of my trouble right here. But, you know, here I am, I'm still around, so I mean, the only thing I can figure is the man upstairs has got some reason for it, Dan. Yeah.
How long have you been on oxygen?
5 years. Yeah. Yeah. 5 years. And it's it's beginning to creep in more the past 3 or 4 months, Dan. I've slowed down considerably. What I could do 4 or 5 months ago, even with the oxygen, I can't do today. No. Matter of fact, when the youngsters had us come and live in this house with them, I noticed this set of steps. There's 4 steps, 14 steps. But I don't know whether you've ever seen them or not. But if push comes to shove and I ever have to, I can get a little elevator installed there, one of those little seat elevators. Bingo, can get me up to the steps. Right now, I make those 14 steps. I have to stop up the top and catch my breath. Yeah. But otherwise, well, we're going to continue to tell sea stories, and we've got what they call a Southwest Regional World War II submarine veterans coming up in Laughlin, Nevada, April 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th at the Ramada Express Hotel there. Have you ever been there? They've got a beautiful big room. Dan, if you are being involved like you are at Regis with the program that you have, first time you're in Laughlin, be sure to go there because they've got a big round room that on the hour they show World War II things. The big screens, there's 5 big screens they show things. And by the way, you know that one picture of me coming out of the prison camp, they've got it. They show it. It's not on the screen very long. By the time you count to 5, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's another picture. But they've got that rascal.
Do you consider yourself a celebrity nowadays?
Well, Dan, I do have to admit there aren't very many guys that come up from a sunken submarine. I guess we do have to admit that. Right, yes, sir.
What do you want to most, when you talk to school groups, when you come to Regis to talk to our students, what do you want them to most remember about World War II?
Oh, I think probably the sacrifices that those of us made. I mean, and believe me, that don't just take my story. You can take almost any veteran, and it's not very hard to find out the sacrifices that any veteran made, Dan, really. There's a story behind almost, and it's interesting to me that I run into so many, not really older people, not really young, real young people, but in between, And a lady mentioned, she'd say, you know, my dad was, and he just never would talk about it. That's a little hard for me to understand, you know, a little hard for me to see, because you know Paul Murphy, and you know, Paul and I, we have a ball when we get together. I mean, we really tell each other sea stories, and we enjoy doing it too. But there again, you could just about take any veteran that served at all, that served out, had any kind of action, Dan, and he can show you where he made some sacrifices. He absolutely can.
Do you think our younger people appreciate these sacrifices?
Well, the responses that we've been noticing, as I mentioned, since you folks have been, the last 3 years, you folks have been doing this at Regis, has indicated to us that they have. Example, this year, Dan, the night that I was there, you never had a house full of people like you had this time. Dan, there was standing room only, if you'll recall, really. And it took you a couple of years. Matter of fact, I had the first year and the second year, I had people, they apologized to me for not making it when I was there. And I said, well, probably a good thing you didn't, because you wouldn't have had, there was standing room only. You probably wouldn't have been able to get in.
In addition to sacrifices, what else do you want people to remember about your experiences in the war?
Oh, Dan, I think the individual people, individuals, particularly men, I guess I would. And I shouldn't have limited it to just men, because we have so many ladies in the armed services today doing the jobs that they're doing. When you ask me about if I had it to do over again, Dan, I almost think, and when I thought about it a lot. I almost think that if I had it to do over again, that I might make the Navy a career. I think if I had that decision to make again, I would have taken the skipper up on that offer that he made. You bet. I have a son-in-law upstairs, 20 years of age. He really doesn't know exactly what he wants to do. And I've told him, I said, hey, you volunteer with the submarines. Hey, you know what? They've got a $25,000 to $30,000 upfront signing bonus. Boy, I'd be chopping down there to that recruiting station as fast as I could go.
So do you consider yourself to be a patriotic American?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You bet. You bet. I know that it gets aggravating when you get to thinking about this politics stuff. But, Dan, I told myself when I was in Japan, hours that I'd spend in that little cell, looking at the four walls, and I said, if I ever get back to these United States of America, I don't care if I have to pick with the chickens. I'll do anything. I'll do anything. You bet. If I have to get out and scrounge and scrape and scratch with the chickens, I'll do it. Just to get back to these United States of America. Absolutely. Yeah.
They're considering a bill in the Colorado legislature that would require schools to teach patriotism. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I'd have to give it a little bit more thought. I have thought about it a little bit, but not all that deep. I've appreciated what they've done. If we're talking about the state now, I've appreciated what they've done. As an example with me, Dan, being an ex-POW, I get on one automobile. At one time, I had 3 vehicles. I had the RV, I had the little vehicle that I towed with the RV, and the present automobile I'm driving. But all 3 of them had POW plates on them. But one automobile, the state of Colorado, gives me a free license plate for my lifetime. Now, to me, that's a step forward. I really think that was really gung ho for them to do that.
Did you ever think that the government wasn't doing right by you guys?
No, I can't say that. I really can't. I mean, my experience been with the VA, as I mentioned to you, I was on 30% disability almost, oh gosh, just a short while that I was a civilian. Because, like I say, the Japs gave us absolutely zilch a medical treatment. No medical. When we took that prison camp over that I was liberated from, one building there, we found over 700 Red Cross packages in there that had never been issued, and medical supplies. My, they never. Then dentures. I have had to wear dentures from almost the second or third year after I become a civilian. No dental attention at all, period. And they called it. Of course, I thank the Lord the fact that I physically, we've talked about a Dick O'Kane, Admiral O'Kane. Dick, it was really getting to him physically. I don't think if we'd had to be prisoners of war another 6 months, I don't think Dick O'Kane would have made it, Dan. I don't think he would have physically. He was in that bad a shape. Fortunately, I got. But we all had, because of the lack of nutrients, what they call wet berry. You could take your hand and push it like that, and it would stay indented for 5 or 6 minutes before but vitamin C primarily on that rascal there. Because I was placed in the Okanold Hospital as soon as we got back to the States. We landed at the Naval Airport there in Oakland, California, when we got in from Japan. But in the Okanold Hospital, they got right on top of that berry thing with me. But like I say, oh my, our government, and they've got me on 100% disability now, Dan, and that's financially, that's really helping.
Sometimes I hear from World War II veterans that they feel a little neglected compared to the kinds of services extended to Vietnam War veterans. Did you ever feel slighted in any
No.
way?
I can't say it. I sure can't say that. No. No, sir. And I can't say that I see any of that going on. And I get out to the VA an awful lot, Dan. I spent there the last year or two. I've spent a lot of time out there. And in fact, I have prostate cancer. They found that. We got on top of it. They've got it not cured, but they've got it retarded. And I have cataracts in both eyes. And I would have had cataract surgery by now, but I went out to take a pre-op exam for cataract surgery, and I couldn't pass an EKG. My heart was racing better than 100 counts a minute. And so now they have me on a medication. I took it this morning, down to 60 a minute. I mean, but they can do those things, and I mean, they're on top of it. 18th, I go back to the eye surgery again.
What are they finding out about your lung disease?
No, nothing there. Nothing there. I mean, it's progressing. Up until about 2 months ago, and I know the same questions asked. The doctors ask, well, are you coughing up? And I hadn't been, but now occasionally I'm coughing up phlegm. That's not discolored, but it is definitely phlegm. I mean, and it's something that I hadn't experienced, man. So it's going through stages.
Does that scare you?
Well, Dan, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior aboard the submarine Tang. I did. That's where I for the enlisted man aboard the submarine, the only place we had where you could absolutely be secluded from everyone was the yeoman's shack. It was located in the after battery room, the cruise quarters areas. It was a small cubicle, 4 foot square, but had a little desk there, and you could lock the door, and I'd go in there for prayer meetings often myself. And I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior, and I'm ready. I'm ready, Dan. Hey, Dad, 81 years. I pick up the obituary column of these people that are nowhere near my age that are gone by the wayside. Yep.
My uncle was in the Navy. He was a pilot on the LCIs. In fact, he piloted one of the first craft on that first wave at Normandy, Omaha Beach. He died a couple of weeks ago. He was 92, so he was a little bit older. My dad is also 81. They were at he was buried at a military cemetery outside of Tampa Bay. And my father told me that they were burying World War II veterans all day long, every 12 minutes. Every 12 minutes at this huge military cemetery.
Boy.
We're losing you guys.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Are we at a point yet where I could demonstrate and show you that?
I want to ask you one more
Okay.
question. I want to ask you about Jimmy White.
Okay.
You have a newspaper here, and the article is a nice picture of Treby Statton holding a photo of her husband, James Milton White, after they were married on August 12, 1943. It also goes on to say that on October 25, 1944, the USS Tang sank, taking the life of White and the dreams of his young wife, Treby. And the article talks about the recent sub-disaster in Russia, reminds Spring Hill woman of personal tragedy. Tell me about Jimmy White, and tell me about Treby Statton's visit to you here in Denver.
Okay. When that Russian submarine, the Kursk, went down a year or so ago on the East Coast, I hadn't seen Treby since she and Jimmy were married. But when we put the Tang in commission, October of 1943, out in Mare Island, California, we were living, even though we were in the commissioning crew, Jimmy White and I were in the commissioning crew, we did not live aboard the boat. We lived at the barracks, and we'd go down daily down the boat and work because we had all kinds of civilian personnel down there. Oh, for instance, I was Fairbanks Morris diesel engines. We had Fairbanks Morris people there. They had Westinghouse equipment. They had General Electric equipment. They had those people aboard. So anyway, Jimmy and Treby were married while Jimmy was putting the Tang in commission. And she was a Louisiana girl. And so when the Tang went down, Jimmy and I become much more deeply acquainted when we got aboard and went out. We made all 5 patrols, the both of us did. Because Jimmy being a first-class gunner's mate, I had this association with Jimmy in regards to a duty aboard the Tang. At battle stations where we manned the topside gun, we had a 4-inch deck gun. And at battle stations deck gun, I was hot shellman. Now Jimmy was first-class gunner's mate, so he was the gunner's captain. He was the gunner crew. He was the captain of the gun crew. So you had a pointer, a loader, the captain. You had a hot shellman, and there was one other lad there that handled the shells, along with the loader. So I got really well acquainted with Jimmy because we used that deck gun on the Tang many times. And O'Kane would not allow any of the brass to go overboard. We kept all the brass. He didn't want the telltale, any of the brass to go over and somebody pick it up and say, oh, that's a brass from a 4-inch gun off a submarine. He didn't want any of that. And but anyway, so Jimmy and I become really well acquainted. And battle station submerged. Jimmy's post was on the helm in the control room, and my post was was a bow plainsman in the control room. And when we took the torpedo on the 5th patrol, Jimmy, being a first-class gunner's mate, for instance, when we were in at shore duty, tied up to a dock anywhere, if you had topside watch, you had to go see Jimmy to get sidearms to go to stand watch, this sort of thing. And he had a locker below decks in the control room where he kept all the sidearms. Well, when we took that torpedo and we finally got ourselves mustered together there, and I leveled the boat off, and we were going to move forward to the forward torpedo room to make the escape, Jimmy went below decks in the control room, and when he came out and came forward, we were getting ready to get the first a group of 4 to go in the escape chamber. He was holding his arms like this, and now the belts that you have a 45 on were web belts, and he had them together, but he had this whole arm of web 45s. He was holding them like this, and he brought them forward for every man to put a 45 on and a shark knife and this sort of thing. And then I was told, I went up with the first wave of 4, and I was told that Jimmy was in the 4th wave of 4 men. He was in the 4th wave. And his body never came to the surface. So when Treby, of course, right after the Tang went on patrol, Treby went back to Louisiana, his wife Treby. And so when she saw me on Tom Brokraw's program, when that Russian submarine went down, she hadn't seen me since we saw one another out in Mare Island when they got married. And so she immediately got on the phone. She chartered a flight, flew to Denver to see me, and brought me this picture of her up there and Jimmy. And she was just so delighted that, of course, now she had remarried. She married a gentleman who was pretty well-to-do down in Louisiana, had a big plantation down there and so forth. And she told me that she said, she just had never ever forgotten her Jimmy. And so she told me in a little note that she has up there that I turned out to be her miracle. The fact that I could relay to her that I'm the last living person to see her Jimmy alive last. And so we had a very nice visit. She came up and she has a computer. I have a computer, and we email, probably at least once a week. We send email back and forth to each other. And I don't know, Dan, if I've ever told you or not, or you were aware of it, but, Dick O'Kane, our skipper, he wrote the book Clear the Bridge. And there's a lad that lives in Spring, Texas, who has acquired the movie rights to that book. And he's got the screenplay written, and when he heard about my affiliation with Jimmy White and Treby, he got Jimmy. I've got a copy of that of the screenwrite of the play, and he had not had Jimmy in there heretofore, but after my experience with Treby and everything, he's put Jimmy in there too. I mean, you might be interested in reading it sometime. But I don't know, this thing to become a movie, I don't know anything about that. If and when it will ever come to pass. So
She's quoted as saying here that I do have a feeling of peace now that I've talked to Clayton Decker. I know so much that I didn't know before. Some people can't understand that after 56 years, I still love this man, the memory of this man. I feel like knowing what happened has been peaceful for me.
Yep.
You gave her some peace.
Sure enough, yeah. Yes, sir. Well, what I mentioned to Dr. Clayton there was the first time I spoke at Regis, with this group that they started 2 years ago. I'm pretty sure this lad I just kicked myself for not jotting his name down. But he was a freshman. He introduced himself to me after I had spoken. And he said, Mr. Decker, I really enjoyed your talk. And he said, I'm somewhat of a submarine buff. And he said, now, I understand that they call submarines boats and not ships. And I understand that submarines are round-bottom boats. They don't have a keel. And I understand that periscope depth back in the boats that you were on was 60 feet, and that you can reach 60 feet in about 30 seconds, and we broke 30 seconds on them, less than 30 seconds with a tang. But he said, the thing, I've also seen Das Boot, the movie, the German submarines Das Boot, about 5 different times. And he said, the thing that baffles me is, I noticed that on Das Boot, in order to keep an angle from getting a real steep dive angle, they would send 10 men to shift the weight from forward to aft. And he said, and I know that on our submarines, which he was right, we had what we call a hydraulic manifold. We would pump water. We would pump X number of gallons of thousands of gallons of water from forward to aft to shift that weight, to compensate for. And my being a bow plainsman, why, I could catch the bubble by asking that man on the manifold to shift me some weight so I wouldn't get too steep. If I got too steep at a dive angle, I'd stand all those boys on the boat on their heads. But he said, the thing that bothers me is, if that be the case, and being a round bottom boat, what keeps that when you make a dive, a crash dive, for that submarine going down sideways? Say half the crew was over on the port side, or half the crew was over on the starboard side. What would keep that boat from going down that way? And I said, well, Dick O'Kane, Admiral O'Kane, explained that to us when we were in the prison camp. And a little device that he made himself that will show you how that works. Now, it's a mathematical problem, and don't misunderstand me. I don't claim to be a mathematician. Matter of fact, math was always my problem when I was going to school. But nevertheless, most all, Dr. Clayton will tell you this, most all mathematical problems, they have a name. The theories, they have some kind of a name. Well, my wife, Ann, has a nephew who is a graduate engineer, and he told me one time, he said, Uncle Clay, that you're explaining there is called opposing forces. That's the name of that mathematical problem. And what happens is you've got the submarine, which is basically round, oblong. It has the ballast tanks around the hull, the pressure hull. You got the flood valves down here and the vent valves up here. And when that water rushes, when you open those vent valves and let that air out, I don't know how many thousand gallons a minute are rushing in there, but he said, we're going to assume that this is your ballast tanks. One on each side. You have one here and you got one on this side. And the flood valves are down here. That water is going to come in then and go up and around, circle up and around. Now, let me show you what happens. I don't know how many thousand gallons a minute that water is coming in there, but in order for me to do this, I have to use my belt. So I have to do this little project here. Let me see if I can get this off here, all right. When that water comes in then, in that flood valve, and it's coming around there, what happens then when you open that vent valve? Here's what happens to that weight when that submarine starts down. Now notice that. You see there's your ballast tanks, and it's just there. I mean, but when that weight comes in there, and comes up over the top of that pressure hull, you want to feel that, Dan? Just feel that. So what you've done, you've transferred it right on the tip. You could do it with your fingernail even. But that throws all that weight, that huge amount of weight that's coming in surrounding those ballast tanks.
So this is why you were taking off your belt that night in class.
But you see that weight then is just straight as an arrow right down the center. It wouldn't make any difference if all the crew was over on one side or the other. Now we do have what they call trim tanks. We had what they call trim tanks, and when you're up on the surface, why every now and then while we'd play games with the trim tanks, But they didn't really matter that much because you got people going forward and aft, starboard to port side, moving all the time, huh? When you're on a submarine. I mean, remember it's a submergible city, and we would use it as such. Matter of fact, in my particular case, we always used to make sure that whenever we took on small stores before we'd go on patrol, my buddy and I in the forward engine room, his name was George Zofkin. There's another side story too, Dan. George Zofkin and I met when we put the Tang in commission. He was married, had a son 2 years old, same as me, same set as me. He come to look me up right away.
Hold on just a second. We're going to just stand back in here.
Get you back, yeah.
George Zofkin come to look me up right away. He said, Clay Decker, I understand that you're married, have a son 2 years old. And he said, I want to tell you my status. I've got a wife, son 2 years old. I just bought a house over at 67 Stony Ford Avenue in San Francisco on the hill. And he said, it's one of them small postage stamp things that you step off the sidewalk and 2 steps and you're in the front door. The backyard is about big enough that you could put a small picnic table and 2 chairs. But he said, it's a 2-bedroom home, it's 2 stories. And he said, there's just my wife and son are going to be there when I go aboard this Tang and make this patrol, go on this Tang. He said, would it be possible to talk you into have it? Now, I understand your wife, my first wife was working as a secretary for the CEO at Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California. Would it be possible to talk to you and having your wife give up her apartment? She had to have a babysitter for our son. Come to my house. Your wife and child live with my wife and child. Your wife could help bring in the beans. My wife could strictly a housewife. She could babysit, and you and I are going on the Tang. So we did that. We did that. And George, bless his heart, when we went to battle station submerged, when I was in the forward engine room on the throttles, and they went battle station submerged, I left the throttles over to turn them over to George, and I went forward to the control room. I figured that George was back there when we took the torpedo. And I was absolutely flabbergasted when I got up the forward torpedo room. There's George. Now, I tried to talk him into going in that first wave of 4, which I got into. You know what? When we get our R&R, when we drop anchor at Pearl Harbor and go, we'd go to the Royal Hawaiian for 2 weeks. 2 men to a room. Today it costs you $150 a night. 2 men to a room at the Royal Hawaiian for 2 weeks. Anyway, George and I were roommates out there all the time, you know, and our wives were living together back in the States. We'd go out on Waikiki Beach and frolic and so forth in our bathing suits. Here we are getting ready to go up that first wave of 4, and George helped me put my Mumsalong on. I'm trying to help George put his on. And George said, no, Clay. He said, you go ahead and go with this wave. And I said, why, George? Come on, go with it. He said, no. I said, why? He said, I've got a confession to make. And I thought, confession? What the hell are we talking about confessions? I mean, we got to get our butts off of this boat. He said, Clay, I can't swim. God, that blew my mind. I mean, and I stop and think about it all the time that we'd frolic at the Royal Hawaiian on Waikiki Beach. George never did ever go in the water. But I never knew that a man couldn't swim. But I told him, I said, George, you are going to have to know how to swim. This Mumsalong, we'll use it as a Mae West life preserver when we get above. He said, you go ahead with this first wave. He said, I'll come up with the next wave. Well, the only survivor in the next wave was Hank Flanagan. And I talked to Hank right away. He said, Clay, you no more had crawled up in the tower, in the escape chamber, and George walked over and crawled up on a bunk in the forward torpedo room. He didn't even give it a try. So, and he was, but like I say, I was absolutely flabbergasted. He told me that he had come forward. You know, we'd already sank all those ships and everything. We fired that last torpedo that got us. But George had turned, we had an oiler back there. He had turned the throttles over to that oiler just long enough to come up to the galley to get a cup of coffee. And he was standing right at the hatch there at the galley, which you step through it, and there's the radio shack and the control room. You're in the control room. When the torpedo hit us, He said, I just stepped through there and pulled the hatch closed and dogged it. So, because like I say, I was absolutely flabbergasted. And I have to say this. Back in those days, in my younger years, after I got out of the prison camp, I didn't have enough to tell his wife, Martha, that story that I'm telling you now. I couldn't do it.
Would you tell her?
I told her that he went down with a boat. And he did go down with the boat. But I didn't give her any details. I didn't tell her that I saw him up there and that he crawled up on the boat and didn't attempt to make it. So
Yeah.
I just couldn't, that's all. So anyway, that's the way that wound down.
Let me ask you this, Clay. How often do you think about that wartime experience in the normal course of, say, a week?
Not too often, Dan, other than the fact that my wife Annie kids me now and then because every once in a while, I learned to speak some Japanese, and what we referred to it, those of us who learned it the hard way, we called it pig Japanese. You just learn this, Annie will ask me something. I said, oh yeah, that's Johto. I mean, that's good, And he said, well, how much do I put in that? Or you put Scotia. That's a little bit. Just put a Scotia in there, So she gets a kick out of that. And then once in a while, somebody will ask me about counting. One of the first things they taught us, first things they made us learn in Japanese was to count 1 to 10. Ichi, ni, san, si, go, roku, chichi, hachi, kuju. And so once in a while I'll use that, but no, I don't think about it that much. I mean, Dan, at times it seemed like it was a dream, really. Yeah, it's a long way down the line. Other than the fact that what I mentioned to you, that boy, I said it to myself so strongly. If I ever get out of this, I will go back to the United States and scratch with the chickens if I have to. You bet.
Of all the experiences you've had in your life, raising a family, your long and happy marriage with Ann, your successful business, how would you rate your wartime experiencing, being sunk, prisoner of war camp? Is that the most important experience you've ever had in your life?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes, absolutely. You bet. You bet. It sure is. It sure is. It sure was. Even though, like I say, I did have a successful business. I had a trash hauling business. I had 12 trucks, 10 routes, and believe me, I was in that thing for 27 years, and that was an experience. And this old man had to really be on his toes. I mean, back in those days, I mean, competition was really tough. And but I got the job done. I did finish 2 years of college up at Fort Collins, Dan. I joined the Navy. I was just finished up 2 years at college up at Fort Collins. I was going to be an entomologist. In my junior year at Paonia High School, I got to work with a deputy state entomologist in what they call the codling moth control program over there. And I really got involved in it, and I thought, hey, I get a degree in entomology. I'll go to work for Standard Oil Company down in South America and be one of their hotshot guys to go down there and classify bugs for them, But yeah, I didn't. I'd fed all the cattle I wanted. My grandparents had a cattle ranch, and I was born and raised on a cattle ranch over there in Paonia. That I can show you pictures back there in the bedroom, Dan. My immediate family, my mother and father, moved up from Taos, New Mexico in 1917. I wasn't born. I didn't get born until 1920 in Paonia. But they come up to Denver in 1917 from Taos, New Mexico, in a covered wagon. I'll show you. They got a covered wagon, a team of mules. So, and Paonia, Colorado, if you've never been there, My grandpappy was the second settler in that valley in 1882. The year they moved old Chief Uray and his wife Chabita and the tribe out from there over to Montrose. So it goes back a few years. It goes back a few years.
So that Regis student kind of surprised you with kind of a good question. at the
Oh
end.
my! I thought to myself. Of course, you know, up front he told me that he was a submarine buff, and but I will tell you that little demonstration, his eyes bugged out about that far too. And doggone it, like I say, I kicked myself, Dan, because I had his name. I was going to remember his name and so forth, and I didn't. And at that time, like I say, 2 years ago, he was a freshman. He was in freshman class. Could he have been, what, 19?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.